Hello, and thank you for joining us today for an introduction to deed research. Today we have Lanny Otteson speaking with us. Lanny is a member of the Texas Historical Commission's Archaeology Steward Network. He is a history steward with us, and the history stewards play an important role in helping us do research and conducting research in places that we just don't have time to get to. So we really appreciate all of the work of the history stewards, and we especially appreciate the help of Lanny Otteson with this presentation that we're about to begin.
Thank you for the introduction, Jenny. As Jenny mentioned, today we're going to talk about introduction to deed research, and it's going to focus primarily on land ownership records in Texas. So the outline of the course, why research deeds, look at some places or some reasons you might want to research deeds. And I got stuck on that. I promise I won't do this 10 times. Okay.
It's okay.
Okay. You know, it's even worse when you do it a second time because you know you can stop. Okay. All right. Thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. As Jenny mentioned, we're going to look at an introduction to deed research and focus primarily on land ownership records in Texas. Quick overview with a course outline, why research deeds. We're going to look at some various reasons you might want to do deed research, resources and definitions, how to get started with deed research, deed searches themselves, content you will read on deeds, and mapping a tract. Although we're not going to focus a lot on mapping, it's important to know. Documenting a deed history, and Deedopedia is a word I made up to talk about some fun facts, and information and sources other than deeds, how to ask for help, and then what's next. So why research deeds? The primary reason is identify property ownership history. It's going to tell you a lot about who owned the land, maybe settlement patterns. Is to identify the property location, shape, and boundaries and quantity. That can be very tricky. It might indicate when individuals settled in a location. It might identify family relationships like father, mother, sons, daughters. In my own personal family, I've had experience where I've had difficulty documenting a specific ancestor and found a deed where a set of ancestors was deeding for the love of their daughter and son-in-law and named them. So it confirmed that family relationship. It might identify historic features such as cemeteries, schools, churches, mills, military sites, and it might identify the names, ages, and relationship of enslaved individuals. So the information from deeds can be valuable for building cultural histories and family genealogies. And for African American history, it might be the only documentation available providing insight to a family before emancipation. I believe deeds are one of the most overlooked tools for family genealogists. I've met several genealogists that are working on their family history, and I got stuck there again. So just edit that out. Somewhere find a break point in there. Okay. So resources and definition. Deed indexes. Reverse index is an alphabetical list by name of grantee or the buyer, and the grantor or the person conveying or selling property. And the direct index is just the opposite of that. It's going to alphabetical list by last name of the grantor and then the grantees. So deed record books or volumes, typical contents are deeds, but they can contain a lot of other very important documents like wills, power of attorneys, mortgages, divisions of estates, and plats. And I'll point out that all counties have separate plat books, but you'll frequently find them blended in with deed books. And then what is a deed? It's a formal legal document containing a transfer of property from one person to another. So how do you get started? So the first thing is, if you're going to do a reverse property search, for example, you want to find that name in the indexes, but you need to know what county you're searching in, obviously. And the assumption is if somebody on this class has property they want to research, they know what county they're in to begin with. But the first thing I suggest do is search the internet for online deed records for the county that you're researching. I find that in Texas, almost all but I think there are 2 counties that don't have online deed records. And the ones that do, it's partial. Some of them have all of them, some of them don't. So it's a variety of things. So some examples are Travis County Clerk records, or Texas County Clerk records. Texas File is a subscription-based service that's very useful. It's a pay by the page for deeds. Usually it's about $1 a page. CourthouseDirect.com is another one of those. QuickLink, CoFile is another one. Wharton County, for example, I know in Wharton County, if you use the online search tool, they charge you $25 a day to use it, and then $1 a page if you want to buy the copies of the deeds. But if you go to the Wharton County Clerk's office, you can use a terminal there for free. Galveston County, like a few counties across Texas, has all their deed records available online, and they're free. Travis County has a couple of different locations, the Texas Portal to History for deeds up to about 1942, and Travis County Clerk, you can research and download deeds from 1986 to current for free. So which county to search in? Now we talked a minute ago about what county you're in, but if it's a deed from say the mid 1800s, one thing to keep in mind is many counties were initially created and then subdivided to create many more counties down the line. So I'll use Travis County, for example. It was formed out of Bastrop County in 1840, but it was later cut up into 11 different counties. So if you don't find the deed you're looking for in the county where it's currently located, you might look to see what county was that formed from, because it could be recorded in any one of those counties prior to its formation. So for example, in Travis County, there's a lot of deeds that are also recorded in the original deed books in Bastrop County. So now let's talk about getting down in the weeds with reverse deed searches. And I'm just going to give an example. Russell Crawford Booth is thought to have had purchased land in Travis County in the 1870s. And you want to know when it was purchased and how many acres and where it's located. So the way you do that is search through the reverse deed index. And remember, we're looking for when Russell Crawford Booth purchased land, so he's the grantee or buyer. So in the reverse index, and this one happens to be the A to D surname index. So when you search for RC Booth, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 records of him purchasing land. And look at the date ranges over here, and you can see this 1872 date, for example, is the earliest transaction that he made. And the following, the last column is the deed record book and page number. So if you wanted to continue this reverse search to see who A.M. Davidson bought the deed from, we happen to be in the A through D book, so we could page to the D section and look for Davidson and to see who he purchased that land from. So it's just continuing his step backwards through time. Then a reverse index, again, is just the opposite of that. It lists the grantor or seller name first and then the grantee. So using the same RC Booth that we looked at earlier, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 records where he sold land. Now, I haven't looked at all 6 of these particular deeds, but these could represent the same 6 pieces of property we saw him purchase on the reverse index. But here, let's just look at this one, for example. He sold a tract of land to E.T. Moore in 1879, and it's recorded in Deed Book 44, page 145. And notice that the name is not always spelled consistently. This first one is BOOTHE, abbreviated RC. Here it is, RC or Russell C, Booth with no E. You'll find a lot, especially in these very old deed indexes, of misspellings, so check them all. And the last thing, those were online research tools. Those are actually searchable deed books or deed indexes. And like I mentioned earlier, Galveston County is fully searchable online. And some of those tools are really cool because if you put in the name and hit the search button, you can actually click on the next to see the image of the deed without having to swap around between index and deed books. But if all else fails and the county does not have available online records, go to the clerk's office. Almost every county in Texas, you can still go to the clerk's office. A lot of them, like this image happens to be Wharton County, you can walk in and go directly to the deed indexes and the deed books that are in the shelves. Some of them you can't. Travis County, you can't do that, for example. But it's fun to go get your hands dirty. Go to the real archives and see the real documents. Okay, and a little bit about deed content. So the deed record, selling a piece of property or conveying a piece of property, almost all of them kind of start out with this preamble that's something like this. And this is an example off that RC Booth deed we were looking at earlier. Know all men by this public instrument, yada, yada, between A.M. Davidson and RC Booth. A couple of things I wanted to point out in this is A.M. Davidson and Mary of Travis County of state of Texas and RC Booth of the county of Travis and state of Texas. So that tells us, looking at this deed, and that one was dated 1872, that they are residents of Travis County at that point. So that this is very useful because it might say, and I've seen plenty of examples of this, resident of like Franklin County, Tennessee, or some other state. So it can tell you, help you build a timeline of migration of families and people. So the next bullet it might have, not all of them do, how much they paid for it. In this example, they paid 250 specie dollars. Sometimes they'll say gold coin, sometimes it doesn't say anything. And it'll usually tell you how many acres is being conveyed. In this case, it was 50 acres and what part of the original land grant that land resides on. In this case, it was the Santiago del Valle grant in Travis County. And most of the time they have a legal description of the property that include meets and bounds description. Like this one, for example, it says beginning at the west corner of a tract known as the MacArthur tract, running thence north 45 east with the line of said MacArthur tract, 724 varas to a stake. So that drew a straight line. I've got this little wind rose or compass rose over in the corner. A lot of times when I'm working on these old deeds, before I use software to plot them out, I might draw a little sketch of this just because I'm used to doing this. And you can see there's the starting point of the MacArthur tract, and I know north 45 east is that direction. So you can kind of manually plot these things out once you get accustomed to doing that. So the last part of it, it ends with a note by the clerk recording the deed and the date it was recorded. And one thing I want to point out on that the difference between the date the property was sold and recorded can be many, many years. It can be months, days. I've seen them up to 20 or 30 years apart. So the deed, you have to really pay attention. You know, earlier or here at the top, we're seeing this tells us when they're residents of the Travis County, for example, and when the deed was executed between those two parties is a date. But if you look at the clerk's record, if that one happened to have been recorded, say, in 1885, one might think, oh, well, they're there in 1885 or just got there. No, you got to look back up at the date the deed was actually executed between two parties. So next thing is this word veras, if you're not familiar with it, is a Spanish land measurement or Spanish units, and those equate, a single vera equates to 33 1/3 inches long, and that was actually adopted by Congress officially in 1919. I talked to a surveyor recently about this issue, and this wreaked some real havoc in Texas because there was like 5/8 of an inch difference in between what had been used for, I don't know, 50 years or somewhere after Texas stopped using the Vera. And although you'll find Veras all the way into the early 1900s and mid 20th century, but what it did, it changed the property size of a lot of boundaries across Texas. So you'll see things in feet, inches, in yards, and rods and chains, but the earliest deeds are likely to all be in Veras. Okay, and then one last comment on deeds. They can be anything other than land. I've seen deeds for herds of cattle. A really cool one I saw one time was a guy was preparing to take a herd of cattle up the Chisholm Trail, and he wanted to prove they were his, and he lists the quantity, the marks and brands of every different owner's cattle he had. And they actually drew a little symbol for the brand mark and the ear marking on each of those cattle. But it could be a general store with all of its contents. So there's lots of cool stuff it could be in there. One more quick thing on these compass bearings. Again, this deed spelled out literally in the deed, North 45 East. It might be abbreviated in 45E. It could be later when the surveyors got more sophisticated and were able to actually record minutes and seconds. You'll see it like at the bottom here, 45, north 45 degrees, 30 minutes, 45 seconds east, or that might be expressed as a decimal point, but they're all the same thing. So mapping a track, those compass bearings we were just talking about, I use a free online tool, and anybody can use this. It's really cool. You can enter the survey calls, like this circle right here, North 45 East 724 was that first call, and you can select Veras, feet, rods, chains, a bunch of different things in here. The only trick to this is you got to know where that starting point is located. You see a little flag here on this. This is a screenshot right off this plat plotter tool. In this case, and it's a good example for anything that you want to map, although this is not a mapping class today. I had to do a lot of deed research around the borders of this track to figure out where the starting point was. So, and then when you do that, then you've got to know where to drop that flag. So there's a couple of ways to do that. If it's a piece of property where you know the location, maybe it's a current piece of property, and you can pull GPS coordinates on that point, you can actually enter the GPS coordinates and start it at an exact place. And I've done that before. Take a Garmin out to the field with me, pull a point, and use those as a starting point. Now, a surveyor would have a coronary of overusing a tool like this. It's not exact, but it's close enough for analysis of where a piece of property goes. Okay, one more quick thing about the mapping. What's really cool about this particular tool is that you can export, for example, a KML file. And a KML file you can drag and drop into Google Earth Pro. And with that, and that's what this yellow line is in this particular screenshot. I exported the piece of property it just plotted, dropped it in here, and it drops it in to Google Earth at the coordinates of that starting point that you declared. And then you can rotate the view, exaggerate the terrain, and if you're fortunate enough to get or have access to geo-referenced historic aerials, which you can easily find online, you can drop those in the same location and then really have some fun with it, because you might be able to see what the area looked like in 1935 or 1940 before it was fully developed. Okay, and documenting a deed history. The easiest thing to do is just make a list. And like this, for example, is a chronological list from a most recent property owner or deed transaction in 1972 and going backwards in time. So in this this is actually one I'd worked on a couple of years ago, and this was my starting point. So I started the reverse index search with Raleigh Ross MD, and then you can see he bought it from Edward Rothgeber, mispronounced that one. So then I go back to the reverse index and look for Rothgeber and find he bought it from Smith. And in this example, it's one of those nightmarish deed research examples, actually, because then it fell into probate, and those are challenging to search. But it's a good key point that not everything you're going to search for when you do a reverse search is in the deed records. It may be in probate minutes, it could be district court minutes, but that gap right there, like this 1930 gap and this 1914 gap, it actually changed hand twice. Once you get past that, then you're back to the deed books. Okay, another way to document a deed history for those genealogists out there that know what a family tree, well, we all know what a family tree looks like. It's a tree, right? So this particular piece of property, and I threw some names in here. There's a lot more information you could add to this. Like this was the Blair Audubon Wildlife Preserve in Northeast Austin. So a person named Blair had sold it to Audubon. Blair had bought it from a mower bought it from a windlant, so on and so forth. So the reverse deed search is just going back through time and all the way to the original land grant, which is sovereign soil. And I think I've used that term sovereign soil, or may use it again in the future of the presentation. At least in Texas, think of it like this. Before the Spanish and the Mexicans began issuing patents or grants for land, it was sovereign territory. It was owned by the indigenous peoples of North America. Was not documented until it began transactions with Mexico and Spain. So in this view, I've seen some reports, for example, this Coahuila to Tannehill transaction here this one I happen to know was about 4,000 acres. And he began selling it off in pieces. Well, there's hundreds and hundreds of more branches off this tree, but I'm only highlighting this one section right here. This is another view of that exact same piece of property, and it was more detailed because I was including it in a report. And this reverse deed search was all for this. You see this little red box right here? It was 5 acres of land. That's the Blair Woods Preserve. And me and some members of the Travis County Commission were researching Fort Coleman or Fort Colorado, which was reported to be in that location or general area. And we wanted to see if any of the deeds in the history of that piece of property mentioned Fort Coleman or Fort Colorado, hoping they did. None did in this case, but you can see it took a lot of iterations to get to where did that 5 acres come from? Because the problem is you may come across these situations where you start following a small piece of property back. This 5 acres came from 94 acres right here, and the 94 acres was made up of 2 tracts, and it just keeps getting fragmented the further you go back. To trace them all the way back, it gets pretty challenging. But this one required, well, reviewing these 24 deeds, but I think I looked at maybe 150 deeds to get to that point. Some other information sources for deeds, it's good to know, is historic newspapers. Not every county or city has them, but it was very commonplace for newspapers from the, say, towards the end of, I'm going to stop here for a sec because my dog is barking. Hang on a second. Sorry, Jenny.
All good.
Okay, I'm back. Unfortunately, my wife is upstairs on a Teams meeting too. I can hear her speaker going. Roxy, come here. Okay. Let's see. Let me start over again on this. Okay, information sources other than deeds. Historic newspapers are a great source to get you in the right time frame. Not all counties have them, not all cities have them, but it was very commonplace in the late 1800s, well into the late or mid 20th centuries, that newspapers reported property transactions. This little screen clip over here, for example, I was researching this guy right here, Newton Collins, and I knew he had bought or sold this piece of land, but I didn't know what year, so I wasn't sure what index to look in. In Travis County, for example, the deed indexes run from the first set of books runs from 1839 through about, I think it's 1893, and they're all in single volumes. In some counties, there's a book for each decade, so you got to know where to start. But the other thing about this one, when I did find that transaction in the index, the deed record book for that was one of two deed record books in Travis County that have been missing for a long time. And we actually just located them recently. Uh, but it might be your only record of a property transaction is the key point there. And in regional history books, almost every county has some local history book. They might tell you when an ancestor or person that you're researching purchased land and who they bought it from. So that might give you a starting point. Some other, I might have skipped a slide there. Nope. Some other information about our sources are historic maps. In Texas, the GLO has got a whole series of maps on original land grants. And this example was a land ownership map from Travis County from 1891. That's real useful. This clip in the corner here is a City of Austin property ownership plat book that's in the Austin History Center. And what it shows you is the owner's name and the deed book number and the page number. These are very useful. This is really the precursor to our modern county appraisal district map GIS systems. So it used to be on paper. Almost every county has these, and they're in various states of accuracy. You just have to look for them. But this one was actually in Austin. There are two. This is a 1965 book, and I think they've got 1945 in there as well. So those are very useful. I mentioned the GLO website earlier. That's a clip from the GLO server. So when you click on a piece of property, the map view is very useful because if you know where you're looking, you zoom in on it and click it. And like this one right here, the grantee was R. Vince or Richard Vince. And then you can go to the GLO land grant search and actually download a copy of that grant. Then at the county level, this, as it says here, Wharton County Appraisal District, this is a map view from their GIS server. When you click on a piece of property, almost all of them work the same way. They give you a little snippet like this and view more info. And when you click on that, you're going to see the current property owner's name. And if you're fortunate, somewhere on that page, many of them give you a little snippet of the last 2 or 3 deed transactions, or like a little mini deed history that'll list the book number and the page number. And then you can use that to use some other online deed search tool to go retrieve that deed. And the last, and I'm sure there's other sources I may not have covered, but the last thing I wanted to point out is other information sources or abstracts of title. There's a lot of these in different archives around the state, and if you're lucky enough to get your hands on an abstract of title that covers a piece of property you're doing a reverse deed search on, they are indispensable because they will have done all the work that you need to do, or most of it. So they're very cool. Okay, move on to some fun facts. Deedopedia. One thing in the deed records, this black or negative image that you see in the background here is an image from a deed book in Travis County. And you can see that if you can make out this writing, it says internal revenue 50-cent stamp canceled. When a person carried a deed to the county clerk to be recorded, the clerk literally transcribed exactly what he saw, including stamps and seals. So in this case, the clerk wrote out a description of what that stamp is. And you can see the image of the stamp here. Here's a little bit larger image of the same thing. I've seen some of these transcripts where the clerk actually drew a little rectangle and tried to draw it to make it look like a stamp that was actually on the document. And this isn't real important to know. It's just interesting fact that it's the way people paid for their filing fee for deeds as late as 1967 was go to the clerk's office, buy this stamp, and they put it on their deed when they recorded it and signed across the face of it, canceling it, meaning it couldn't be taken off of here, steamed off of the deed and reused for another transaction. So the other thing down here, this little squiggle, I don't think we can quite make it out in there, but I think it says seal inside that squiggle. Sometimes it's real obvious, sometimes it's not. And what the recording clerk is notating there is this image. It's the notary seal on the document. Looks a lot like today's notary seals. So let's just talk about the whole deed process as a workflow. And I want to point this out because it's relevant to the accuracy of the deeds and timing, or even if they exist. So especially in the early days of surveying, before, let's say, early 20th or 19th century, they were out surveying property that had never been surveyed before. So they're out in this wild zone and they're out there fighting thunderstorms. Maybe it's wintertime and a famous Texas blue norther's about to come through, or there's arrows flying at them. Texas was overrun with, not overrun, it was fully populated with wildlife. There were leopards, bears, all kinds of things distracting them in the field. So in addition to that, they had their little notebook they're carrying, and they had to record all of those deed calls we looked at earlier, like the North 45 East bearing we were talking about. And I've seen some actual surveyor notes, and they're generally really hard to read. And part of it is they're very, very old documents. Deterioration of the document itself. But you can imagine if you're in the field, depending on the condition, making notes, those could be pretty rough. So the surveyor takes the notes to an attorney or notary that prepares the deed. And we'll back up for a second. That's this original deed document right here. And the attorney gives that to the person that is selling the land, and the seller has to make it to the clerk's office to have it recorded if they make it there. And the key point in it, I showed distance and time here. In many locations across Texas, the county clerk's office could be miles and miles away from where the property was at. So it took a lot of effort to get there. And to me, it explains why occasionally you come across deeds that just aren't recorded, but then you find later transactions for the same piece of property that mention the deed. because what people tended to do was, again, this original deed, they kept this in their possession because their document was recorded at the clerk's office. That happens to be how I got a copy of this one. It was a person that had the original deeds for their ancestors' land. So anyway, that's one reason it might or might not be at a clerk's office or in the deed books. But it's another point in the process, how clear were these notes? Did this notary copy it correctly? Did the clerk copy it correctly again? And then later, deed books were transcribed, sometimes multiple times. I found examples in a couple of counties, across the state in the 1870s, Congress had authorized counties to transcribe deed records and all county records, as a matter of fact, that were deteriorating. And I've seen examples where one district clerk had written to the local newspaper and all their deed records were eaten by mice or insects. And so they were falling apart. So they copied the whole books by hand. And then later, when typewriters came along, they transcribed those with a typewriter again. So there's a lot of places for error across all of these movements. So you'll find mistakes on them. And it's really not uncommon, especially when you go to map a piece of property. You'll see if pretty quickly if they're accurate or not. And then a few just tidbits about that whole recording process. Up until well into the 20th century, clerks were using pencils and papers to transcribe deeds, and it's astounding how late that went on. I've seen, I won't name the county, but up into the 1960s where there's still handwriting indexes and deeds, where other counties were adopting typewriters. In the early 1900s, this great new technology came along called the photostat machine. And actually what that resulted in, you'll come across those. I'll back up here. This negative image is a photostat. So there's some facts about that, about the recording process. And the key to it, again, until photographic recording processes came around, and of course in the 1950s, Xerox machines, they stopped manually copying them and began reproducing them photographically, and they became a lot more accurate. So additional reading, some things you can go check out. And I think when Jenny sends or makes available a PDF of this, these links should be intact as long as they exist. Texas State Library and Archives has this great little PDF file you can download that tells you about county records. Travis County Historical Commission blog by Christy Koslow has some of the same kind of information I've got in this presentation. Categories of land grants in Texas, that's very, very useful document from the GLO. And it's important to know the difference in a land grant and a script and a preemption grant, that type of thing. And a couple of publications I've used over the years. Texas Land Grants is something, both of these you can find on like Amazon, and they're reasonably priced. That handbook's pretty pricey because it's a real valuable book, but they're good reading. And then how to ask for help. There's lots of people willing to help out there. And Jenny mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, introducing me, I'm a history steward with the THC, and as part of the role we serve, your local county historical commissions will help you. But the keys are, especially when you go like to a clerk's office or to an archives, I say be polite, be specific, and be patient. I've been in more than one archive when someone walks in and says, my great, great, great grandfather was Jean Lafitte, and can you tell me everything about him? You can't do that. And you also got to remember sometimes the staff at the clerk's office is they're well trained to preserve documents like the deeds and can direct you to the deed indexes and can help you show you how to search, but they may not have historical knowledge or expertise. So again, be polite and be patient with them. So we talked about historical commissions, genealogy societies. A lot of counties have those. You can generally find somebody in a location. I've reached out to all of these in multiple locations across the country, and they're all willing to help. Current past property owners are very important. I've researched a lot of property and say you can't locate a current owner, but you know where it's located at. You might knock on the door or try to contact some neighbor of that. They may have been there for a long period of time, might can tell you something about it. And of course, their descendants. And if for a fee, some county clerks will search for you. Uh, they generally won't do a complete reverse deed search. They'll do one or two names at a time for you to help you get started. And then researchers for hire. I like to do all my own work myself, and if I had unlimited time to travel to other states and do that, I would. Uh, but where I can't, APG, I've used some APG members paid for research to give them specific instructions on what I'm looking for, and that's another great resource. If you click on that, there's a whole list of, and it's constantly changing. So what next? I hope you take what you've learned here. I hope I've helped you learn something, and I want you to share it. Pay it forward. That's the most important thing we can do. Support future researchers. That's the funnest thing we can do, is help new people get started, because none of us are around forever, and we need a next generation coming up to learn some of this. I'd love to see some young folks get involved in stuff like this. So share your knowledge and offer your help and support the THC certainly, and get involved with your local historical commissions. They all need help. Appreciate your time, everybody. Okay. See anything we need?